Hello, my name's Olurotimi Osha. I'm continuing with my discussion on the Watergate scandal, but I'm going to discuss an aspect that it was consequential, but as a historian would later state that it was written out of history due to misogyny. And I'm just talking about the role of the wife of the Attorney General under Richard Nixon. That's John Mitchell's wife, Martha Mitchell. Her role as a whistleblower, and she features in a film I've discussed concerning Watergate. That's All the President's Men, which stars which stars as Bob Woodward, Robert Redford, and as Carl Bernstein, uh, Dustin Hoffman. So the two journalists who were dogged and, of course, pursued the investigation of the Watergate break-in, which eventually led to the resignation of Richard Nixon. Their doggedness is remarkable, and I'm going to do something about the role of the Washington Post in a subsequent video because they pursued this for about almost 2.5 years. But right now, I'm going to discuss somebody who was leaking to the press, and that's Martha Mitchell, who was the wife of the Attorney General, John N. Mitchell. So in the movie All the President's Men, there's a time one of the female journalists who collaborated with Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein was speaking with someone, and then there's a disconnection, right? And that happened in real life. So she was speaking with Martha Mitchell, right? And apparently she was in a hotel. She was being held hostage in a hotel. And as she was trying to disclose what was going on concerning Watergate, she was disconnected. What really happened was a an ex FBI agent who had been, um, you know, used by her husband to sort of keep her, in check, would yank the phone cord out of the wall, right, to keep her from talking. Um, and Let me just give the background, the scenario, and I'll discuss the characters later on because characters are very important. So, Martha, uh, Martha Mitchell, the wife of the um, Attorney General, was used to talking to the press. She liked, after she'd have a nightcap, she'd call the press and start giving them information about, um, you know, information she'd seen rifling through her husband's papers or from eavesdropping. And at the time of the Watergate's break-in, apparently her husband, probably to prevent her from leaking information to the press, it wasn't supposed to be, it wasn't supposed to be scandalous or anything, but she might have been lured to this hotel in California, right? Her husband, maybe the pretext was that they were attending an event in California, and then he heard, of the break-in, which happened on June 17, 1972. Right, that there was the burglary at the work Watergate. That was the Democratic National Committee's headquarters at the Watergate complex, and her husband gave a press conference denying the uh, any involvement of the um, committee headed. That's the CREEP. That's the acronym for the committee to re-elect the president. And because he was no longer attorney general at this time, because Nixon selected him to run his campaign for re-election, right? And and of course he was the one managing the slush fund. The slush fund was to pay um, the plumbers. So the plumbers was this um, group of ex FBI and ex CIA operatives that had been hired by into this group. It was called the um, White House Special Investigatives Unit. So its nickname was the Plumbers, and their role in this regard, and with the creation of CREEP, right, was to sabotage Democratic candidates, use espionage to sabotage them, to also, and they also use kidnapping. So John Mitchell approved of all these techniques, methods. And so at this point, they had actually done an initial break in that was undetected to plant, bugs in the Democratic National Committee's headquarters at the Watergate. This was, I think, the first one was May 28th, right? 1972. That was undetected, but they were caught, right, on May sorry, on June 17, 1972, and it was in the papers. So five of them were arrested. One of the men that was arrested was a guy called James McCord. I'll give the background of James McCord later on, but she was the bodyguard of Martha Mitchell's daughter, and he was also the director of CREEP. He was the security director of CREEP. That's the committee to re-elect the president. And her Martha Martha Mitchell was being held captive at a hotel in California. Her husband had flown back to Washington, right, and left her at the hotel in California, and left an ex FBI agent who was also a member of CREEP and the plumbers to watch over her, right? And his name was Steve King. I'm going to talk about these characters later on, but I want to quickly give the scenario, the event that happened. So when uh, Martha Mitchell would get access to a copy of the LA Times, and she saw that, well, there was a burglary at the Watergate, and this guy was arrested, James McCord. But meanwhile, there was a press conference saying that, well, that the creep had nothing to do with it, and the White House had no involvement. So she put two and two together, and immediately realized that, well, that it wasn't true. First of all, that it wasn't true that creep had nothing to do with it, since she knew James McCord. The public didn't know this, but she knew that James McCord was security director of creep, and he was her daughter's bodyguard. So immediately she called the press and started to leak information again, to act as an informant to the press. And this was the reason her husband had left her in California, because Martha Mitchell was very popular with the press, right? In 1970, there had been a Gallup poll, and 76% of Americans knew her, right? They could identify her. She was on the cover of Time magazine as one of the most influential women in Washington, right? So she was a socialite, right? So, which was unusual. She was, the wife of the U.S. Attorney General, but she liked the publicity, right? And she liked to, talk to the press. She liked to appear on television and things like that. So her husband had been trying to prevent her from leaking information to the press, and that's why he had this FBI guy hold her there. But as she realized she was putting two and two together, she started to talk to the FBI, sorry, to the Washington Post, right? A reporter of the Washington Post that didn't know that she was contradicting her husband's press conference, right? That, well, creep had nothing to do with, that's the White House had nothing to do with the burglary. the FBI guy, Steve King, yanked the phone cord off the wall. And, it just made the press more curious. It turned out they now moved her against her will, right? They seized her and moved her against her will to, and held her hostage. They held her captive in Westchester Country Club in New York. They transported her there, and there she tried to escape from a balcony one day. She tried to escape from a balcony to get out because she couldn't get out. Nobody knew where she was. And at this point, five agents now, held her down, and they held her down. She got stitches. She got assaulted, and she was held down, and because her husband had given instructions not to let her out. These instructions may have come from Nixon himself, because at some point Nixon's personal lawyer, a guy called Herb Kalmbach, was summoned to the hotel, and when he came, he called a psychiatrist. He called a psychiatrist to sedate her with tranquilizers, and they injected her. Meanwhile, a crime reporter was looking everywhere for her in New York. When they found her, they saw she was bruised and she had, blue arms from injections and all that. Eventually, at some point, they said she was placed in a psychiatric facility in Connecticut. So all of this was happening. They were just trying to keep her from leaking information out to the press. Of course, this would impact her relationship with her husband, and around eventually she started, when she was released, she started calling the press, trying to tell them that, okay, her husband was a fall guy. This soured her relationship with her husband. And unfortunately, um, uh, by September 1973, they separated, right? They separated. Meanwhile, Nixon went on to win, right? Because the purpose of the campaign, right, the committee to re-elect the president, right, creep. The purpose was to make sure Nixon won the presidential election, right, for a second term, and the elections took place um, November 7, 1972, and he won in a landslide. He won, 520 electoral votes against his opponent. His Democratic opponent was the Senator George McGovern, who had just 17. Nixon would win 61% of the popular vote, one of the largest elect presidential landslides ever. And he also won 49 states out of the 50 states in America, 49 out of the 50 US states. Now, maybe something else that, apart from the activities of creep, right? The illegal activities of creep, which um, uh, Martha uh, Martha Mitchell started claiming was responsible for Nixon's landslide victory, was, she was claiming that it was due to the dirty tricks by her husband's creep committee, right? And the plumbers, because they were sabotaging Democrats and doing all sorts of things. And so she said, that it was that Nixon only won due to his dirty tricks. But something else that might have been responsible was, uh, so George McGovern, right? He had selected for his vice president a guy called a U.S. senator called, I think from Missouri, called Thomas Eagleton. He selected Thomas Eagleton as his running mate. So Thomas Eagleton looked great on paper. He had been he was a U.S. senator since 1968. He was a Harvard Law School graduate. He, served in the Navy, right, for 2 years. He'd studied at Oxford. He looked, great on paper and all that stuff. But it somehow got now leaked to the press. We wouldn't be surprised if, the creep, right? Of course, that was they probably were responsible for that, to leaking it to the press that this guy Thomas Eagleton, who had just been selected as the running mate for George McGovern, had actually been hospitalized, and he received electroshock treatment for mental illness. So that was an era when there was so much psychophobia, there was sadism, there was stigma against mental illness at the time. So he got McGovern concerned, and he started reaching out to psychiatrists and spoke with Eagleton's psychiatrist, and they asked him to withdraw. And so he, after 19 days after he had been selected to be running mate for McGovern's presidential ticket, Thomas Eagleton withdrew because of the disclosure, the public revelation that he'd been having electroshock treatment, right, for psychiatric illness. And so he he would replace him with Sergeant Shriver. Sergeant Shriver was the brother-in-law of the former president John F. Kennedy, and we what's his name? Um, Arnold Schwarzenegger married Sergeant Shriver's daughter. Um, yeah. So yeah, Arnold Schwarzenegger married Sergeant Shriver's daughter. So later on, uh, what's her name? Martha Martha Mitchell would now start to reach out to the press, and then she started to collaborate. She gave a deposition. She started to cooperate with the Democratic uh, the Democratic Party because they filed a civil lawsuit against I guess the Republicans, against Creep, right? And she gave a deposition. And of course, this affected her marriage. Unfortunately for her, though, she would fall sick. She would fall sick and you know, of a form of cancer, and she would die on May 31, 1976, just about just a year over her separation from her husband. And just as her husband had kept her away from the press and had her held hostage and kidnapped, he would also again, because he was still legally married to her, they hadn't yet divorced, although they were going through a bitter divorce battle for alimony. But she died before the divorce. And so he would attend her funeral late with her daughter, and he would keep the public, from attending. So it would keep it private. So it was an unfortunate situation. Um, Now, just some of the characters, right, that were involved, and it's also ironic something that the husband said. It was a very terrible thing the husband said when at his sentencing in February of 1975. So he was convicted January 1st, 1975, of conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and perjury charges. So he eventually served 19 months in prison, right, in federal prison. But before, at his sentencing on February 1975, he would say something terrible. When they sentenced him, he said it could have been a whole lot worse. That they could have sentenced him to spend the rest of his life with Martha. So that was terrible. So it was like he was wishing her dead or wishing her not to be with her. Um, so in any event, there were some interesting characters, right, involved. Very interesting characters that were involved. Steve King, the guy who held her hostage, right, who um, kidnapped her. By the way, James McCord, after he pled guilty, right? I mean, after he was convicted. He cooperated with the government for a lighter sentencing. In February 1975, he did confirm that her statements, because she claimed she had been kidnapped, right? She was held against her will and she was kidnapped. But the White House started to disparage her. They were dismissing her, making her seem she was crazy. In fact, Nixon said it. They said, oh, she has a drinking problem. They were trying to make her appear unstable. I mean, and much later on, it's funny, Nixon would grant an interview, and there's a movie of it. Is a Frost Nixon? The British journalist David Frost would when he was speaking with Nixon. Nixon admitted to her. He said, "Well, if it hadn't been for Martha Mitchell, there'd be no Watergate scandal, right? So that it was her that was leaking information and got the press really curious, right?" I'm going to do something about the role of the press in the Watergate scandal, so I don't make this video too long. But she was significant in her calling the press. She called it out early. Later on, after her death, journalists said, well, that Martha Mitchell did warn America, but nobody paid attention. So Steve King, the guy, the FBI former FBI agent who kidnapped her, was never charged with a crime. Right? He was never charged with kidnapping. It's ironic that nobody was ever charged with anything with kidnapping her. Um, by the way, he went on to become ambassador to the Czech Republic in President Trump's first administration. So it was ambassador to the Czech Republic from 1917 to uh, 2021. He's still alive. He's in his 80s. That's Steve King, probably about 84 right now. He's in his 80s. He's still alive. So, but James McCord, who confirmed, he was one of the guys who was arrested in the burglary, one of the five people who was arrested in the burglary, the Watergate break-in on June 17, 1972. Now, let me give the background. Interestingly, he got a master's from George Washington University, my alma mater. So James McCord is kind of interesting. He is he started in the FBI, and then he worked in the he joined the CIA. So he was a CIA officer, and he was laid off in 1970, and he was hired uh, as one of the plumbers, and into the creep, right? So again, creep, that's just acronym for committee to re um, the campaign or committee to re-elect the president. So it's called, the acronym is creep, the campaign to re-elect the president, right? The acronym is creep. So, and of course, the person who was running it, managing it, was the Attorney General, John Mitchell, right? And he had this slush fund, and just to pay a lot of illegal things, and he approved their means, their legal methods, espionage, kidnapping, sabotage, of Democrats, right? The rivals of President Richard Nixon. So this guy, James McCord, he had also he'd been in the Air Force. He was a lieutenant colonel on the U.S. Air Force Reserve, um, and apparently, while he was in the CIA, he was involved in the MK Ultra project, right? And so he'd done a lot of things, you know, for the CIA. And in fact, somebody wrote a book later on claiming that he was actually a KGB mole, right? So he left the CIA in 1970, but he got hired, um, by he got hired by Mitchell into this into the to be one of the plumbers, as a in the White House Special Investigations Unit. The White House Special Investigations Unit, it was like a brainchild of Ehrlichman, right? And Ehrlichman, of course, he also went to prison. Now, another character that was involved is Herb Kalmbach. Herb Kalmbach was a personal lawyer of Richard Nixon. He also got disbarred. But he got his license reinstated, and he did time. He was sentenced, to prison for his involvement in the Watergate scandal. Right, he's the one who called the psychiatrist to inject Martha Martha Mitchell, the wife of the Attorney General, with tranquilizers to keep her silent, right, to restrain her and hold her hostage. So, and who else? Yeah, so these are some of the guys that were involved in this particular scenario. Uh, it's interesting that James McCord, he did corroborate all the statements by Martha Mitchell regarding her kidnapping. She did say that she was kidnapped, and she was dismissed when she was saying it initially, because they called her sort of a blabbermouth. In fact, her nickname was Mouth of the South and Martha the Mouth, right? Um, you know, but and she sort of seemed, she was a bit, I guess, because she was also viewed as a bit, I don't know if eccentric is a word, but she was a you know she was a fame hugger, and she was a bit controversial. Remarkably, there was something she did that was very controversial with the Queen. There was a state visit, July 1971. She had publicly refused to curtsy to Queen Elizabeth, the Queen of England, Queen Elizabeth II. She said no American should have to curtsy to a foreign monarch, right? So she refused to curtsy, and it had a backlash, right? One of the bodyguards of Queen Elizabeth, he was also Earl of Lindsey, would write her a reprimand letter, right, for not showing proper manners, and he would give a press conference and actually call her stupid. So she didn't shy away from controversy, and I guess people like that, sometimes it could be difficult to take them seriously. But again, what she went through was terrible. Her being kidnapped, and just the way she was mistreated. It just showed the sort of hectoring tactics and fascist tactics of the Nixon administration. Right, they were very illegal, kidnapping. But again, nobody was charged with the kidnapping. By the way, although Steve King would, he denied it. He denied it. But again, James McCord, who had also worked for the FBI and CIA, would confirm, would corroborate the statements of Martha Mitchell, that she had been kidnapped, and held against her will, and um, she had been illegally, injected, tranquilized, sedated against her will. Nixon, of course, would say, what Nixon would say later on was that she was a distraction to John Mitchell, and she had to be kept in check or something. But anyway, I'm going to stop this video here, and I'll do subsequent videos discussing the Watergate scandal. My name is Olorotimi Osha. I'll keep you posted. Thank you.